In this last section on services, we are going to look at 3 different specific kinds of services and how we might use those services in our application. The first kind of service we will look at is a factory. Please note here that a service can be a factory regardless of which method of service construction you used to create that service. In classic computer science, a factory is an object who constructs other objects. This is useful in case construction of the other object requires some kind of logic. So let's first look at how to build a factory, then we'll talk about some useful places to use a factory service. So here I have a class constructor called course. And down here I have a controller that has a method that we can assume is bound to some kind of a button. And that method needs to create a new instance of the course class, and then pass that into the catalog.add method. Unfortunately, in this scenario, you can see in the constructor for the course that it needs an array of instructor IDs. But the controller itself only has a list of instructors. So we need to translate this list to a list of IDs. Additionally, the course constructor requires an ID, but the controller is creating a brand new course. So let's assume that for us, -1 means that the ID is unknown, but that logic doesn't belong in the controller. So this is a place where a factory makes a ton of sense. The knowledge of how to construct a course is not the responsibility of a controller. So let's construct a factory service to do the construction for us. So I'm going to go down to my controller and add a reference to the service that I'm going to create. I'm going to call it course factory. And down here where I create the new course, I'll call that course factory. And let's assume that I make a method on it called create course. And then I'll pass in the values that are available on the scope that need to go in to create a new course. Alright, so that's all the information we have for the controller. Now let's go up and actually create that service. So here's that create course function. It needs to take in the same parameters as I call down there, so that's title, credits, department, and instructors. Now what I really need to pass into my course constructor function is a list of instructor IDs, not a list of instructors. So I'm going to convert that list of instructors to a list of their IDs. Now I can construct my class using the same parameters, the new list of instructor IDs, and then the initial ID, which is going to be -1. So admittedly, this example is quite contrived, but you will find often that the logic about how to construct a new object can get a little complex, and littering that logic around everywhere that you need to construct the object is definitely less effective, so creating a factory to do this is a great idea. The next type of service that we will look at are stateful singletons. A stateful singleton service is a service that is an object that contains data and/or state. This is much easier to show than explain, so let's go see one in action. So I want to have a simple class registration page. Up here, I've got a list of available classes, and down here is the user schedule. If I click register, then the class should show up down below. And then down here we can have a drop button next to each class, and that will let the user drop the class if they want. I've got my controller set up right here, but we're missing the place to store the user's schedule. So I'm going to create a service for that, and this is going to be a stateful service. So I know that this schedule is going to need a list of classes, so I'll create a classes array. And I need functions to add and drop classes. So let's start with the add class function. Now if the user tries to add the same class twice, I don't want to allow that to happen, so I'll filter out that case. And then assuming that that's not the case, then I'll just push the new class onto the list of classes. Now we also need our drop class method. And in this one, all we do is look through the list of classes and remove the matching one. Now I'll go down to my controller and add that new service. Put that line of code in and just bind that service right onto the scope. Now let's see this in action. Okay, so now if I click register, the class appears down here below. If I click it multiple times, it doesn't show up. And from here, I can remove classes. These kinds of services that contain data and state are often useful to hold current state while a user is using your site. And the nice thing is that any controller that needs to display this data can just add the service as a dependency and show the same data. The last kind of specific service we will look at is services that are functions. This kind of service is a bit more rare, but in the right situations, they can be really helpful. So I have here a user controller, and one of the elements of data I want to display is the user's GPA. But all I have is their grades. Calculating their GPA requires a special calculation. So one of my options is to create a service called GPA Calculator, which has a calculate GPA function. So that can work, but honestly, after looking at this, it seems kind of silly to have a class whose sole responsibility is to hold one calculation. It's not really reasonable at this point to think that it would hold any other methods. So it would be just fine if this was just a function and not an object. And now we can rename this from GPA Calculator to something more appropriate for a function. And add this as a dependency. And then we can just call it right here. So let's see that in action. So now we have our function that we can use to calculate GPAs whenever we want. Obviously, there are many kinds of services that you can write, but these services that we have just looked at are ones that are a little bit different from the typical kind of service that users might build. So seeing them in action can help give you more ideas of how to write services to make your Angular development cleaner and easier. Let's review with a quiz. Is it acceptable for services to be stateful? Yes, it's very acceptable for services to be stateful. Name 4 ways to create a service. You can create a service with any of the following: value, constant, factory, service, provider, and filter. If you pass a service method a constructor function, what will your service be when it's injected into other services and controllers? That's going to be a singleton instance of the class that you pass into the service method.